Yes, it is. So I think we can start with this. Good evening, all of you, and thanks for coming to hear about greening global supply chains. Those of you who are here in person, thank you for making it. We know it's been hard to get here, and this is kind of a lively area around here. And for all of those of you who are watching online, we know a lot of people around the world are watching a lot of these sessions. So thanks very much. My name is Chip Barber. I work for the World Resources Institute. And first off, I'd like to thank WWF for hosting us here and our co-sponsors in putting this on, and also the UK's Forest Governance Market and Climate Initiative, FGMC, which has supported both of our work and a lot of others and has helped us to also put this on. So our program today, we had someone who had to drop out at the last minute from Ghana, from the Forestry Commission there, but that's too bad. She got pulled off into a negotiation or something. But we have some really great guests who I'll introduce in a moment. We have a video that we're going to start with in a moment. It's from my colleague, WI Luis Amaral, who's from our office in Brazil. He's in Sao Paulo. Couldn't make it here for all the reasons we all know, but he recorded a short video. So Luis runs all of our supply chain work at World Resources Institute, thinking about these issues, and very focused on Brazil. He's been involved in the FACT dialogue that a lot of you will know about, trying to pull in the private sector and civil society side in the dialogue on transparency and traceability in that process. And he came to us out of the private sector. He was working in the banking sector in Brazil, looking at how to ensure the sustainability of the kind of investments that private banks were making in the agricultural sector in Brazil. And so before we start that, let me introduce Governor Gary Joffa from the province of Oro in Papua New Guinea. We're really pleased to have you here. This is a big forest province, a lot going on in Papua New Guinea, and we're really eager to hear what you have to say. And Mark Engel, who is the supply chain chief, I believe is the title, at Unilever, which is I think we all know Unilever is a company that's a huge consumer-facing company that's been on the forefront of thinking about how we make our supply chains for the things that we use and eat more sustainable. So we're really keen to hear what you have to say. But first, let's turn to my colleague Luis down in Sao Paulo on the video.
The world's land resources are limited. With an ever-growing population that becomes richer and more consuming, demand for food, feed, and fibers are also going to grow. It means that agricultural output must also increase. Although a critical sector for human development and well-being, agriculture is an industry with a high environmental footprint. The tropics lost 12 million hectares of tree cover in 2020, according to data available on Global Forest Watch. Of that, 4.2 million hectares, an area the size of the Netherlands, occurred within humid tropical primary forests, which are especially important for carbon storage and biodiversity. A significant part of that still caused by the advance of soft commodity production. As a result, many governments, private sector actors, and other groups have proposed new policies and practices to make soft commodity production and consumption better. Many of them aim to leverage the power of supply chains to promote such transformation. Companies with such commitments, including greenhouse gas emissions reductions targets and deforestation and conversion-free pledges, now have a total market capitalization of over $1 trillion. But it's one thing to commit to eliminate deforestation. It's decidedly more complex for global companies to actually do it. Therefore, advances have been made, but we are not there yet. So why is it so hard for companies to stop deforestation? Products like palm, cocoa, beef, soy may change hands dozens of times from the moment they are harvested until they end up in candy bars, toothpaste, or baby formula, making deforestation tracking a very complex puzzle. Any discussion about market transformation needs to be done through two lenses, demand and supply. The behavior of those two forces define the incentive and disincentive structure for actors to change. My intervention today will try to connect some of these dots. I will point out 5 inconvenient truths that need to be considered and tackled by policymakers and practitioners on the field on this next phase of efforts to green soft commodity supply chains. So first, we need to understand that not all commodities are created equal. So remedies are also different. Agricultural production systems vary significantly, and so does their response to those incentives and disincentives. While some products tend to be produced by larger industrial-like operations, such as soy in Brazil or Argentina, others tend to be mostly managed by small farmers, such as cocoa in West Africa. Even in the same supply chain, there might be very different production systems. In palm, for example, while half of the production in Southeast Asia comes from large industrial-like plantations managed by processing industry itself, the other half, processed by the same companies, come from smallholders, farmers managing small plots of land. This information is relevant because it means that policy and interventions in one sector can have very different consequences for significant parts of the production. There's no one-size-fits-all approach to change producer behavior. Second, markets are connected, so systemic changes are needed. Connected markets means that spillover effects can happen. As commodity markets are global, this interconnection means that changes in one place could potentially influence changes somewhere else in the globe. For example, if deforestation is tackled in one part of the globe, market connection can create incentives for it to move somewhere else to respond to continued demand growth. It does not mean, however, that localized action, policies, and interventions are not needed or are not important. It means, however, that complementary action at global level might also be needed. It also means that demand-side measures in consuming markets are as important as supply-side in export ones. Third, no deforestation policies and actions can actually impact commodity prices. Unfair competition depreciates the value of legal and green supply. As illegally produced soft commodities are brought into the international markets, they create unfair competition with the legally produced ones, as the producing costs tend to be much lower. For example, a product produced in land that was grabbed will tend to be much cheaper as opportunity cost of the land is not embedded into the product the same way it is for a legal activity. So it tends to depreciate market prices, and its impacts will depend on the amount of illegality in the system. So really eliminating illegal deforestation is absolutely necessary and should be the number one priority for all actors involved in this debate. But there's also an inconvenient truth about freezing global land footprints and commodity prices. As any other market, soft commodity prices are defined by a function of supply and demand. So anything that could potentially happen or potentially increase demand vis-a-vis a baseline will tend to push prices up as all things remain equal. But inverse is also true. It means that if the world is successful in freezing our current footprint of land dedicated to soft commodities and therefore reducing deforestation, a goal that we absolutely need to avoid climate catastrophe, long-term soft commodity prices will tend to be higher than they would otherwise if land expansion continued. Obviously, it does not mean the prices in the future will be higher than prices today, but it means that the pressure will be up. So what we need to do is that we need to also double down on efforts on doing more with less, on top of ending deforestation. In other words, we really need to guarantee that we produce more food, more fiber, and more feed per unit of land already used. That's very important for the future of the systemic change. Fourth point, transparency is a precondition for traceability, but traceability is not absolutely necessarily from farm to fork. Although it's good having farm to fork traceability, it's needed. It's good for risk-based due diligence, but it's not absolutely needed. There are vivid discussions on whether companies and governments should actually fully trace agricultural trade, and it's something that would probably happen, but it's not necessarily to start acting now. Although advances in technology, policies, and systems have demonstrated that it's possible and cost-effective to do so, as I mentioned, it's not necessarily a precondition to start implementing due diligence processes and policies. What is important, however, is that companies need to be able to measure in order to manage. If minimum levels of traceability and knowledge about supply chain sources, even if you're not tracing everything back to the farm, is paramount for the success of any company's due diligence. Also, without it, they cannot demonstrate progress to their stakeholders. Finally, final point, soft commodity markets are undifferentiated by nature. Through the 20th century, century, many food ingredients have largely been traded in bulk without any differentiation and commercialized according to global prices. The last decades saw the beginning of the decommoditification of commodity markets. In other words, once homogeneous products are now being differentiated according to how they were produced, due in large part to consumer demand. We saw in the 2010s a growth in certification. For example, the Round Table Sustainable Palm Oil was founded in 2004, but 98% of all palm oil certifications happened in the past 10 years. Global multi-stakeholder initiatives like the UN's New York Declaration of Forests, the Consumer Goods Forum, and TFA were launched with commitments to eliminate deforestation from agricultural supply chains. In practice, all of that means we're differentiating two otherwise equal products between acceptable or not acceptable. There are limitations to this revolution. Commitments, as we discussed, have not yet fully delivered on their promise, and they're still mostly limited to richer consumer markets. Alone, they will not solve our global food challenge while protecting forests, but the trend can be expected to intensify in the next 10 years. Desire for deforestation-free products may have sparked this trend, but will not stop there. Other sustainability and ethical concerns like farm income, food safety, and even the quality and taste of products might further fracture otherwise homogenized markets. So to conclude, the key question here for the next decade is, will this process be a slow-moving trend or completely disruptive? The answer will likely depend on technology's capacity to reduce the transaction costs enough to allow the differentiated items to fully compete with standardized commodity markets. In other words, how we'll be able to effectively decommodify commodity markets. Thank you very much.
I'm sure he's watching online, so let's give him a hand. And I must say, he's so interested in passing this on to you that he gave his hair and his beard the best trim I've seen since the pandemic began. He was getting a bit of a wild man look. I talk to him almost every day, and he's looking very trim and dapper. So thank you for that, Luis, and sorry you can't be here in person. I'll now turn to you, Governor. We've now heard a bit of a global overview of that, and very interested to hear how it really looks on the ground in one of the key countries for tropical forests in your part of the world, and a place where you are trying to balance out conservation and development, and including how to deal with the production of commodities. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chip, and everybody who is watching. In Papua New Guinea, it's an interesting situation in regards to land and how we manage it. 97% of the land are actually owned by clans. The people own the land, and only 3% is actually owned by the state and developers. So we're fortunate in that regards because the people have a control over what happens on their land. What is happening in Papua New Guinea, though, is that a large number of our people are not aware of the dangers posed by companies that come in there who are reckless, who are not responsible, and who then encourage the people to basically free up their land for development purposes. And they do this in a way whereby they offer opportunities, they offer revenues, etc., and the people feel that that's development and proceed with freeing up this land for these activities. And we have palm oil, which fortunately is regulated because of the RSPO and the requirements whereby you cannot sell your palm oil if it has been planted on deforested land. So that is a good thing. There is, however, illegal logging that's taking place by criminal cartels, which call themselves companies, but they're not companies because they're just criminal cartels, and they organize crime syndicates. And what they do is they clear fell forests on the pretext of involving in agriculture. And a number of the landowners agree to this because they don't know any better. Sometimes the government finds it difficult to intervene because these are arrangements between the landowners and private entities. And also the government finds it difficult to intervene because, unfortunately, I do admit that within the government systems, there's a lot of compromise and corruption that takes place. I mean, when you're dealing with criminal syndicates, these are organizations that have a lot of money, a lot of power, and they're ruthless in how they approach their primary objective, which is to make a profit at whatever cost which they don't really care about. So that's what's happening in countries like Papua New Guinea, and we need the attention of developed nations to have a look at what's happening and then, say, okay, look, how can we assist? How can we end this? Papua New Guinea is home to the third largest rainforest in the world. It's 0.5% of the world's real estate, and it has 7% of the world's biodiversity, and that's disappearing because our landowners do not know any better. They don't know other options. To them, development is getting rid of these forests and trees so they can plant their land or cultivate their land, and they don't understand that once these forests are gone, they're not going to come back, or you can bring them back, but never in its original form, Well, that's in summary just some thoughts in regards to the subject matter we're talking about.
Thanks very much. We'll come back to you in a little while, but now I think we'd like to turn to you, Mark, to tell us a bit about, from the perspective of Unilever, how are you approaching this set of issues that Luis laid out as an overview and the governor laid out for us as approaching the real situation on the ground?
Yeah, thank you, Chip, and thank you for having us. I think it's very clear that deforestation and avoiding deforestation and talking about reforestation has a big part to play in the 1.5 degree world. We talk a lot about fossil fuel removals, but we just need to realize that 13 million hectares of forest are still disappearing every year. And the thing that really makes me worried is 10 years ago we were all worried about a 5% inclusion of biofuels into Europe, but in 2021 we have biofuels, but we have everybody moving away from petrochemicals, from plastics, from using biomass to burn and to generate heat, and at the same time everybody wants to restore nature. And we have to really, I think, believe at are we defying the laws of physics, or is all of this possible? We very often hear people saying, "Is there enough land?" The colleague from Brazil, he was talking about the intensification of sustainable agriculture, because the pressure on land, in my opinion, is not going to be less; it's going to be worse. And so, therefore, tackling the deforestation is absolutely key, and the intensification of agriculture in a sustainable way. Hopefully we will be able to reduce meat consumption, because that's a big taker of the land, but there's lots of pressure on land. So what we are basically doing is, we use a lot of forest commodities. We're decommoditizing a lot of those chains by selective sourcing. They cannot be anonymous. We have lived through a decade of certification, and certification really has had a great place in the history of getting to sustainable supply chains. But at the same time, you have to realize that you're outsourcing your responsibility to somebody else to tell you that the stuff that you cannot see is okay. And particularly around forest commodities and going to a deforestation-free supply chain, we've just learned that you need to do more than certification. You need to go beyond certification, and so selective sourcing is a big thing for us. If I look at our palm oil chain, we've invested $130 million in a palm oil upstream fractionation plant in Sumatra, so that we can basically have a local presence and know where our palm oil is coming from and know that it's deforestation free. We've just added another $120 million to that investment. We're reducing the number of palm oil mills so that, again, we know where we're getting the stuff from. Another very important thing is supporting the smallholders. I think you cannot fix this problem by excluding the smallholders. They have to be center of the piece. A, because there are a lot of them, and B, they're in the end are the stewards of the land and the forest, and they're closest to it, and so we're putting a lot of effort in supporting smallholders. And then the last bit, and I think this is the novel bit, is we are harnessing a lot of digital technology, because if you look at the first mile supply chain, where in commodity world that's usually the anonymous part, the first mile is where all the abuse happens, the deforestation, the human rights abuse, etc. And so with the combination of satellite tracking and AI and anonymized GPS tracking of mobile phones, we've been able to map together with Google Earth Engine. I think we were the first commercial case study of Google Engine Earth, or Google Earth Engine, and with partners like Orbital Insight and Descartes Labs, we've been able to start mapping our first mile in the supply chain. And when you do that, we get pictures every 7 days, and that's in deforestation terms almost real time. So you can really intervene as and when it happens. And so, for companies like ours, we very much believe in it, that we need to make sure that we know where our commodities are coming from. You need to decommoditize it. You need to map the chain. You need to know what's going on. You need to show what's going on. You need to be transparent. And I think technology is enabling in a lot in the past 2 years, 3 years, in doing that. And so those are some of the things, Chip, that we're doing at Unilever.
Oh, thank you very much. That's really interesting to get those two perspectives on all this. I have a question for you in a second about money, and I'll let you think about it. We heard $12 billion, more or less, who knows exactly. A lot of commitments yesterday to spend money. I think a lot of us have been talking with some of the donors around here, and when you ask them, how are you going to spend this for it to be really effective? To be honest, even people I know well and are pretty smart, from whether it's the philanthropic side or the other, they basically say, that's a really good question, how to make this effective on the ground. So think about that for a second. I'm going to do a quick advertisement, something that you know about, Mark. We're going to be launching next week. It was actually launched, we got beaten to it by President Biden yesterday. There's something called the Forest Data Partnership that USAID is funding. Unilever, Google, FAO, NASA, and I think that's it, and World Resources Institute next week, which is going to try and build on these advances in using of remote sensing technology and other things to build user-friendly data sets that can actually focus not only on supply chains, reducing deforestation, but on restoration. How do we track our progress in landscape restoration? And we're doing that at the UNFCCC pavilion upstairs at the Google Earth Wall on the 9th, Tuesday the 9th at 2 p.m., and we'll be advertising it all over, but that will be a continuation, I think, of this discussion. It will be great. So now that you've had a moment to think about, where would you advise our friends and bilateral and philanthropic donors, multilateral donors, to put that $12 or $15 billion, which they have said they want to halt deforestation by 2030, how would that help you? And we'll start with you, Governor. In Papua New Guinea, what would you put it into, and how would you get it out of the ground? It's not, money's not everything, but it's something. And we've had these commitments. How do we turn that into reality to help with the problems that you discussed before?
There are a number of options, obviously, I can think of. And for instance, in Papua New Guinea, we say we're the richest nation in the region because we're natural resource rich. Cash poor, but natural resource rich. The developed nations are cash rich, but natural resource poor. There's trade opportunities there, The people of Papua New Guinea, the forest people, are the best custodians of this forest. They're stewards that have lived within this forest, lived with this forest, and they know best how to manage this forest. And they are taking care of an amazing asset on behalf of the rest of the world. These forests make up what are the lungs of this earth, And it just makes sense that you would have some means by which you can compensate these people for carrying out this amazing effort to protect these lungs for the world, And a friend of mine in Papua New Guinea said something quite profound, which made me think about how these lungs of the earth are affected by humans. He said, it's interesting how COVID attacks your breathing apparatus. That's what we are to earth. We humans are to earth what COVID is to us. And if you want to start with taking care of these forests, you'd start with the people who are already there, who have lived with these forests for thousands of years. They don't want to cut them down. They don't want to destroy them and replace them in their natural environment with an unnatural environment. They'd like to live with them. But they need a means by which they can be adequately remunerated so they can take care of this forest on behalf of all of us. And I think that makes sense, you know. The other thing is we've got to take a very hardline approach, a collective approach by, you know, forces around the world to eradicate the deforestation activities that are taking place. You know, this is carried out, as I mentioned, by criminal cartels. These are criminal cartels that originate from Malaysia. They wiped out most of the rainforest in Malaysia. They arrived in the Pacific. They've gone to the Solomon Islands and Papua New Guinea, and they're doing the same thing. And we need attention from the international organizations and developed nations who actually know what's happening but turn a blind eye, you know? I mean, where do the proceeds of these crimes go? They go back to some economy. They go back into some investment in some economy. Why don't we stop that, for instance, you know? Why don't we look at the criminal syndicates that are operating there and say, okay, Papua New Guinea obviously can't deal with this, but let's help them. Let's help them remove this cancer that is eating into this nation and its development opportunities and its future, and destroying these forests that are valuable resources, not just for Papua New Guineans, but for the world. And there you have it, the people who are there, custodians of this forest, who can be assisted in some way, shape or form, you know, so that they can continue to take care of this forest on behalf of all of us. And you can help the government of Papua New Guinea and say, look, we understand what's happening here. Let's deal with these syndicates and remove them. Bad actors are bad actors anywhere and everywhere. I mean, this is the only world we have. If they're bad actors in Papua New Guinea, what they do in that country affects some countries, the whole world in some way, shape, or form. Those are just some of my thoughts in regards to what we can do with it. We could also, you know, one of the problems with funding like this is its accessibility. Accessing these funds becomes very difficult. You know, there's layers and layers of red tape. You're talking about government red tape, well, there's NGO red tape as well, trying to just access these funds. And if you have issues with how to access those funds and manage them and look after them, then why don't you send a diagnostic team to this country, whatever country it is, a developing nation, you know? We don't trust you, you're corrupt, you don't know how to manage these funds. Okay, fine. But you come and help set us up, the institutions, put the people there and say, this is how we should manage it together. And finally, what I would like to say is, we need to consult the people who are on the ground, the custodians, you know, the indigenous people. They're not often at that table of discussion. This discussion involves governments and big business organizations, corporations, etc. And the people who matter the most are often left out. They've got to be brought to the table too, in some way, shape or form, through their representatives or NGOs or organizations that, you know, are connected to them. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So I hear three things there. I'm interested for what you can add or reinforce. One is this question of recognition and effective protection of the rights of indigenous people, of the community who are forest stewards. We saw a $1.7 billion commitment yesterday as part of all this from a number of donors to specifically that cause, which I was quite heartened to hear because we've heard lots of good words about this for many years. We've not seen a lot of money, so that's a reasonable start. $1.7 billion will help. But we've also, I think, a big part of the demand for this has been, this can't just be an allocation top-down, this needs to be a process. And I think that's the second point. It needs to be truly a participatory process of project preparation, working and empowering those who are going to get the money. You know, we're a big international organization, WWF is, you can't just give it, we'd like a little bit, but don't give it all to WWF and WRI and things like this. Find ways that we can get it into the hands of those on the ground. And this crime point is, to me, I mean, my day job at the World Resources Institute, I'm the director of the Forest Legality Initiative, and that's what I do. We're starting an initiative with many NGOs in the United States, and Norway is supporting, called the Nature Crime Alliance, which I'd like to talk to you about later, because everywhere you look, it's a fundamental barrier to achieving all these other goals that we want to do. And you can't go after the little people on the ground. You know, it's basically these systemic things, and some of them are disguised as national militaries. Some of them are disguised as big multinational corporations. And some of that money, I must say, and you probably know this, that Malaysian money ended up buying buildings in Seattle, Washington, in the United States, one of which was where the FBI rented its headquarters in Seattle a few years back, just to give you a sense of how deeply systemic and ingrained these things are. So those are, I think, 3 good points. Indigenous people's rights, and in the process in dealing with the systemic transnational crime. So let me turn to you, Mark, about, from your perspective, anything to add to that or reinforce? We're very interested to, how we spend that money.
Yeah, if I can just quickly talk about the forest data partnership, because I wasn't sure that I was allowed to mention that.
President Biden let it out of the bag.
And
so I think we're okay on that.
but we are super excited about that, and we for 2 reasons. The first reason is that it is the integration of different data that is so important, and therefore having the multitude of partners that you mentioned will be able to bring together the different data and the artificial intelligence that is required to do this. So that is super exciting. The second bit is because there's an economic equation. I know that Google Maps is for free, but if you really want to look at satellite maps that can calculate what the carbon quantity above the ground is, you're talking about very expensive inputs. And so it's very important that the data and the insights that partnership will generate, in the end of the day, will be able to be used by a multitude of companies, because at the end of the day, we all have these supply chains. And so we're super excited to be part of that. We're also super excited that the WRI is basically behind it, because it also gives it the credibility that it needs. So happy to be part of that. Then to the money point, I think the indigenous people point that the governor made is absolutely vital. At the end of the day, they have been doing this all of their lives, and it's like we've just discovered that this is necessary, but they've been doing that. So a way to and they're the most disconnected from these discussions, and it's also very often the pledge of the money is the easy bit. The deployment of the money is then always going to be the problem, because there are standards on making sure that the impact is assessed, and how do you do that, and do you give it to the government, or do you give it to the NGO, or do you give it to business, and there's a lot of reluctance to do that. But the pledge that I would make, or the plea that I would make, is that all you need is a segregation of duties. So you need to think about who are the parties that have to do the work, who are the parties that have to provide the technical advice, who are the parties that need to keep everybody honest, and who are the parties that make sure that the jurisdiction, the landscape jurisdiction in the government is actually on board with what we're doing. And I don't care if that is basically the auditing firms or the consultancy firms or let's say government bodies, etc. But I do share the worry that the pledge is the easy bit, and we've seen that time and time again. The deployment of the actual money is always, let's say, the bottleneck in this. And so if I have any plea is we need to work that out. We need to task force somehow. And let's say, what are these models? We have an example in tea where we do that, where we work with DFID in the UK, and we're basically bringing a lot of smallholders in tea into the value chain. So we're basically building a tea factory with our investment, and we have the Wood Foundation, which is a foundation, philanthropic foundation, and they're basically receiving the money from DFID. And they are also a donor themselves, and they set up a certain service company in which these smallholder cooperatives basically receive the agricultural support and the initial investment support. So there is a very clear division of duties, and that's how the money starts flowing. And I think it's really important that we start thinking about which parties do we need and how do we get the segregation of duties. But once we're satisfied that we have them, then the money should flow. And we will make mistakes, but the worst thing we can do is sit here 5 years from now and the 1.7 million has still been pledged but has not been spent?
That's indeed a very good point. Well, that's, I think, some food for thought as we think about how to spend all this money. I wanted to ask you both one last question, and then we're going to open it up and see if all of you have any comments or questions. Turning to thinking about governments and intergovernmental cooperation. We're sitting here at the 26th meeting of the Conference of the Parties to the Framework Convention on Climate Change and many other bodies. We haven't mentioned that much, about how does this, why are we here in this place, and what do we need in terms of the international intergovernmental architecture, the kinds of rules and things apart from the funding, but is this a hindrance? I mean, I'll just be open. I worked in the U.S. government. I was in a lot of United Nations negotiations for years, and I sometimes talk about peak UN. We had peak UN maybe, 10, 15 years ago, and we're maybe running out of the opportunities to solve problems where every single country in the world has to agree on something, and anyone can block it. That there are things that's good for stopping wars from happening. I mean, I'm a big supporter of the United Nations, but for practical problem solving like this, I'm honestly, this is my personal opinion, not so sure that's always the best way to do it. But here we are in COP26. What are the kind of outcomes in the formal process, not all this wonderful stuff going on out here, that would be something that you would see that would help you from the perspective of a subnational unit of government, a governor, or from a large company which is operating all over the world? I'm just very interested in any thoughts that you might have, because we'll be talking to these people for the next 10 days, and it would be good to be pushing them in the right direction. So, Governor, any thoughts on what were your hopes and expectations to get out of this meeting as an intergovernmental conference of the parties and the decisions that were made?
Well, I watched Sir David Attenborough give his speech, his presentation. And as always, Sir David is, profoundly articulate, and he's very passionate. He's 95 years old as well, but he's saying the same things that he has been saying for so long, and now with greater urgency. And I think people have to start paying attention to this. People, especially those at the very powerful decision-making, levels, they've got to, and I agree here with what you've said about the fact that these pledges are made, but then the outcomes are not there. The money doesn't turn up, but the forests are disappearing. These criminal cartels aren't waiting for these pledges to come real. They're going to keep doing what they're doing. The people, the indigenous people, aren't going to wait. They've got livelihoods to sustain. They've got families to take care of, and if they feel that there's no other alternative, they're going to do what they can to survive. So something has to happen. After this, what then? What's next? What happens to this $12 billion that was pledged? I think it was actually 14 billion pounds, which is $20 billion. That's what I've heard.
Yeah, I've heard both figures. It's
yes.
We're all trying to sort out how much money we're really talking about.
Yes.
But it's a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot. So that lot of money has to make it to where it matters. And it's got to make it to where it matters so that it can arrest illegal logging, for instance, deforestation, for instance, provide other alternatives for use of land, sustainable land management, activities that can allow the indigenous people who are the custodian stewards of much of these natural resources to continue to maintain, these resources. And incidentally, I want to mention here, we say indigenous people, and we think of indigenous people as people who belong to a particular area, and they were there, say, when colonialists arrived. But we're indigenous people, all of us. We're the indigenous people of this earth, the only planet that has life on it. And this is what I feel the decision makers need to pay attention to, this fact that we are running out of time. I mean, we all go away saying, Sir David Attenborough made a great speech, he said great things, but are we paying attention to what he has been saying, not just now, but for the last 10, 20 years? And then are we doing anything about it? So, one, I'd like to see this money actually make it to where it belongs and have the results that's needed, as soon as possible, with the same sort of haste and speed that we invest money into developing weapons of mass destruction to, protect ourselves or from some threat. Well, how about we use that type of thinking and, passion and determination to convert these funds into the outcomes that are needed on the ground so that we can arrest illegal logging and deforestation and help people, developing nations especially, with sustainable land management programs that will translate to better outcomes for all of us.
Thanks very much. I think that's a very good point, that we're all in this together to a certain extent. We may be riding some in business class and some in coach or things like this, but in the end we're all on the same airplane. When I was just starting this work, back when I got out of school, and I would tell my parents, friends, they say, so what are you doing now? I said, well, I'm working for an environmental group. And they would look at me and go, oh, so how is the environment? You know, like, and you go, well, you live there too, you know? It's not like because I work in an environmental group that I have some special information about this. You can see the whole thing falling apart yourself, you know? So that's, I think that's a very good point. So let me turn it over to you to ask you. So out of this COP, you know, why are you here, aside from thank you so much for participating in all our events and everything, but out of the more formal process that's the sensible reason that we're here, what can we see? I mean, we've talked about the funding quite a bit, but, you know, what would you like to see? I mean, what would Unilever like to see out of this that would make your work easier and make us be able to go forward?
Well, I mean, at a COP level, I think there are three things that we would like to see. A is that the NDCs, as they stand today, or a couple of days ago, are still showing a 15% increase in carbon emissions until 2030, and whereas we know we need to halve, so there's we're quite a way off in terms of where we need to be. The second one is we would like to see more nature in the commitments. We would like to see more forest targets in the NDCs, because there's a lot of fossil fuel related targets, but I think there's a big opportunity in nature. And the third one is finance. So when I look at what governments could be doing, I think the first one is leverage the global initiatives. I'm so happy that the FACT dialogue is finally started and linking the consumption countries to the producing countries and the forest commodity countries. And I think this is a big opportunity that we can leverage. Then I think creating policies that basically punish polluting industry and facilitate green industry by tax policy, by rules, by whatever is required, is, I think, a big opportunity. And the reason why I say that is that when governments do that, they do two things. They create a level playing field for business, but you're also driving innovation. And if there's something that the private sector is good at, it is innovation. So if you set the policies in the right way and drive the right transformation, business will innovate and will basically make that happen. And then the last bit is forest finance. You know, if you look at nature, I think somebody said that nature could absorb a third of the carbon if we do nature restoration right, but it only receives 3% of the finance. And so we all get very excited about carbon capture technology and which technologies do we need to get out of fossil fuels. But I think if more investment in nature, in the restoration of nature in the right way, both environmentally but also socially, making sure that the right people benefit, making sure there's no land grab, making sure that people's livelihoods are going up. I think there's a job for governments to do. So that's what we would like to see in terms of what the governments do. You know, then I have to also turn the responsibility to ourselves. I think we need to set the bar much higher as forest commodity companies. We need to set the bar much higher. There are two forces in the market that will drive change. A is the customer demands, and B is the financiers' demand. And so I think if the financing community, and there is a lot of change in the asset companies and the asset under management companies, I think 40% is already basically under a net zero commitment. If the financiers stop financing, let's say, operations that are not in line with what we need, and if customers like us and others stop buying and making sure that we are much tougher on ourselves in terms of getting to deforestation-free supply chains, you know, 2030 is a great commitment, but I think companies need to set more aggressive targets and lead the way there. And I think that those are the kind of things that we would like to see come out of this COP.
Well, that's a full agenda. Let's hope that we can push it in that direction. Thanks very much to both of you. I want to open it up. We have, how long do we have about 10 minutes left. And so could you kindly pass me the microphone in the middle? I think that's what to pass around. Is that?
Hello? Hello? Is this working too as well?
Yes, so I will pass this around. Can you do that? Thank you. You watch out for your headphones. And could I just ask you to try and be fairly succinct and identify where you're from and who you are? We've got one here and then one back there. Please.
Hi Chip, thanks very much for the panel. David Saddington, head of the Nature campaign for COP26. Thank you very much, Governor. Thank you very much, Mark. Mark, thank you very much for pointing out. Of course, yesterday the Prime Minister and the President of Indonesia did launch the FACT dialogue, the Forest Agricultural Commodity Trade dialogue, and within that dialogue of 28 countries, of course, because we think that is, that smaller group to actually transform the market representing 76% of global trade there. And the reason we have done this is to really get to that trade lever, because the finance, which is in the trade space, over 100 times outweighs the value of keeping forests still standing at the moment, which is why we have that very targeted intervention. But what I would like to ask, because of course we need sustainability in supply chains not just to be that niche market. We heard yesterday in one of the videos from Christiana Figueres that we need to strip deforestation out of our food system in the same way we have stripped coal out of our energy system. How do we do that? With the FACT dialogue, what would you like to see over the UK's presidency? How can we best work with businesses? How can this coalition of national governments, producers and consumers work with businesses and subnational actors to actually start us on that footing to 2030 and the global vision which was laid out at the World Leaders Summit yesterday?
Governor, would you like to start?
Would you like to take that?
I'll start off. What I would like to see from the FACT dialogue is, I think, from the consuming countries, the concept of imported deforestation and legislation around that, I think would really help, because again, it would create a level playing field, but it would also basically force companies like us and others to pay more attention to particularly the first mile and make sure that we decommoditize the commodity chain. Because commodities is actually a word that is, I don't think it's part of this time anymore. This was the past, and I think that it doesn't fit in 2021 in a world of, let's say, deforestation free, and where we want to go to. So I think the whole concept of the legislating in the consumption countries on imported deforestation and making sure, again, that with regulation we punish and incentivize the wrong and the right behavior I think is a very good thing. I think for the production countries, and I have all the respect for countries like Indonesia and Papua New Guinea, that there is always an economic and livelihood equation as well as an environmental equation. But I do believe that there are enough use cases now to basically show that you can have it all. And that, by making the right choices on which lands to develop and which not, and better, let's say, trees that give more yield and require less water, etc. There is a lot of development going on, and the difference between the output between the best plantations in the world on palm oil or soybean and the worst ones is usually a factor 1 or 3. So there's a huge opportunity to do this intensification of commodity sourcing by doing the right thing. So I don't think that it has to be a trade-off between economics and environment in that sense. And I'm just happy that the dialogue is there, because it's always been a dialogue between industry, and then it's usually seen as the Western, like a Western colonialism on telling the forest countries what to do, and you Europeans have cut your forest 400 years ago, so why are you telling us not to now? And I think that I really see for the first time with the FACT dialogue that we are moving beyond that. And so that's why I'm very positive about it. I think, Arifa, we're having a session on Saturday somewhere to talk about this more. So I'm very positive about that. And I think if we could just achieve those two things that I just mentioned, I think we will already come a long way. And then hopefully, if that can come along with finance in the right way, and it can attract some of the finance that was pledged yesterday, I think that would be a very good outcome. And fast as well. Not in 10 years' time, but fast.
Thanks very much. Anything to add to that, Governor? Or you want to take the next question? Or? Okay. Well, I'd just like to thank you, David, and your colleagues for getting the fact dialogue going. I confess we've been involved in this, being pretty skeptical when I heard about this, trying to pull this off in the number of months that we're there. And I know it's been pretty fractious, not just the producers and the consumers. I know the United States, my own country, has not been particularly helpful in some aspects of this as it went along. I hear a lot about this, but it's going on. It's never going to be an easy conversation, but to start it off here, I think this is great. So thanks for you and your colleagues who really pushed this through, and the Indonesians, of course, who have been coaching it. There's, for example, one last question back there. Where did our microphone go? Oh, you got it. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. My name is Peter Wells. I work on arts and landscape regeneration. You've both touched on something very interesting here, which is a common problem that we see coming up again and again, which is that we have the technical tools to deal with these problems, but what we need to address are underlying cultural solutions. So my curiosity is that while we have these monitoring technical frameworks in place now, which are a huge help, what cultural and social infrastructures are you both investing in that are going to deal with these long-term contagions of poor land use, organized crime, and so forth? What are these systems going to look like 50 to 100 years from now?
That's an easy one, Governor. Why don't you take that one?
I can't speak for what everyone else is doing, but I can speak for what I am doing in my province. And in my province, I have taken the battle against the illegal logging companies. We've shut down most of them. I'm in court with 2 of the last remaining companies. I've turned to my government, but unfortunately the government organs have been compromised to such a degree that they're of no help to me. In fact, they're busy aiding the cartels. So the only opportunity for me is to take it to court. So I'm funding landowners, and I'm also financing my provincial government to take these matters to court. And I'm very positive that we will shut them down. But once I've done that, then what I've got to go back to my people with is alternatives, because they're going to say, okay, well, you shut this logging down, and yes, it may have been illegal, but it was the only form of income that we were seeing. Papua New Guinea is a very young nation. It's 40 years old. And here I want to say, be careful to judge young nations, because oftentimes that's what happens. Developed nations judge developing nations, and they look at them and say, man, you're so corrupt, you're so... Wind back the clock. Get in a time machine to your nation when it was just 40 years old. And what was happening at that time is far worse than what is happening in our countries now, So, for instance, that's what I've got to do. So the solutions I've come up with in my province are sustainable land management programs. And I'm partnering with organizations, reputable organizations such as C4, ECRAF, and looking at what we can do to make use of the resources we have and say, hey, look, we've got this amazing forest. We've got land available. We don't want handouts, but we want help in regards to how we can translate what we have, resources available, into tangible outcomes so that stakeholders can all benefit, And so I've come up with this idea of biostations where my forests, are these amazing assets. They're like a fuel station that pumps out diesel or petrol, and you can go and refresh yourself, throw your garbage out, etc. Well, these are the same things, more or less, but they're the most important stations in the world. They're pumping out oxygen, they're sequestering carbon and storing it, and they're home to an amazing array of biodiversity. They're assets for the community and the province and the country and the world, And I'm sure that all the developed nations out there can help us. They've got the means to do it. And I am actually optimistic because I'm starting to see a lot of companies, large organizations, starting to be more responsible, and that's good. That gives us hope. That gives us, the light at the end of the tunnel that we have been searching for so long.
Thank you so much. Anything to add to that? Or?
Well, first I would like to commend the governor on your personal involvement in all of this, because it's not easy to do that, and particularly in the environment that you're describing. So I really want to commend for what you're doing. We're working on a couple of projects together, and it really makes a difference. So I just wanted to sort of give a couple of perspectives. I think the first thing is there is a cultural element that is missing, which is mutual trust between the parties. That very often gets into the way of driving lasting change. And we've got to find a way of working better together. Very often governments see it as an issue of sovereignty when international parties start to take satellite pictures and everything. But we really need to work together because the interest is the same. The second one is a real understanding of the situation on the ground, and that is that if you're a small farmer in Indonesia, if you have 2 hectares of land and you put palm fruit on it, it's the difference between sending your kids to university and having a decent life rather than no life. And so I think there is a whole social component whereby economically you need to make it more attractive for not cutting down the forest, but going somewhere else and protecting the forest. And that is to do with living wages, with livelihoods, with having financing, because stuff takes time to grow in nature. And I think there is a whole package that is required there in terms of making the economics work for the people on the ground, because that's the only way how you will change it. If that is not reality, is not realized, people will continue to chop down the forest because they believe it's the only way how they can provide a livelihood. And the third bit is, I think larger companies, we have a responsibility to de-anonymize the commodities. And so if I give you our example, we were buying palm oil and we had no idea where the stuff was coming from. Now we have $250 million investment sitting in Indonesia, and we have 150 people on the ground, agronomists, people going out to the mills, going out to the plantations, helping smallholders, getting RSPO certification, getting smallholders access to better palm trees that are more resistant to drought and more resistant or need less fertilizers, etc. And so I think there is, let me call that technical support. And I think those are 3 of the things that you're referring to, where those are realities that need to be true for us to significantly leave a lasting legacy in that space.
Thanks very much. Those are great points. We're close to out of time here. I wanted to respond to one thing that you said, Governor, about looking at corruption in the early days of the so-called developed countries. I saw Leonardo DiCaprio was wandering around here. He's around this week, and back some years ago he made a movie with Daniel Day-Lewis called Gangs of New York. I'm from New York City, and if you want to know about what corruption was like in the 19th century in a place like New York City, and this is like 60, 70 years into the history of the United States as a nation, that's a good movie to watch because it's pretty accurate and it's pretty ugly. First, thank our great technical support from WWF. Thank you so much. These things don't work unless that happens. And last but not least, standing quietly in the back, watching me like a hawk to make sure I do everything right, is John Dodsworth, who is really the person that pull all of this stuff together from WWF UK. So thank you, John, so much for this. And with that, thank you again, and I will release everybody so they can clean this up for the next event. And you all have a good evening. And there's many things we're all involved in over the next 10 days or so. So we hope to see you again at some of those events. You can find out about all the things here at WWF. We're co-hosting the Nature Zone Pavilion, which is really exciting things. We had a big protest in police there this afternoon. All sorts of things. Hopefully it won't be like that every day, but so please do join us. So thanks very much, everybody.